Welcome to Red Pill Nation. I'm Scott Veritas, and today I'm speaking with Benjamin Boyce. Benjamin is a writer, poet, commentator, and a former student of narrative arts at Evergreen State College. Today we'll discuss the Evergreen College meltdown and its impact on current events, as well as the impact that intersectionality as a whole has had on human development, art, and media. You can subscribe to Benjamin's self-titled YouTube channel and follow him on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce by following the links in the description below. Benjamin, welcome to Red Pill Nation. Thanks for being here.
Hey Scott, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited to talk to you. You're somebody who I think occupies a sort of sweet spot where you're interested in a lot of the same issues as me, but you're not hard one side or the other. You don't have a very agenda-driven kind of narrative going on when you talk, whether it's on Twitter or elsewhere. And so you're somebody that I've been kind of looking forward to speaking to at some point.
Well, thank you very much. I try to be hyper agenda or be. It's not that I don't have an agenda, but I do am pretty sensitive to people having their agendas and wanting to. My project right now is to consciously try to provide wiggle room in these different narratives that are clashing pretty forcefully in the public domain right now. So it's nice to try to be flexible myself, even if I surrender certain levels of certainty in order to do that, and inject a certain amount of hesitation into my position. But, you know, there's different content calls for a different level of audacity and tenacity.
Yeah, for sure. I think that that's the content that I personally want to see, is people trying to give themselves some wiggle room and not having that level of certainty. I think that certainty leads to predictability. I find that with a lot of people in the sort of, I don't necessarily want to call it the culture war space, but just let's say the commentary space on YouTube or elsewhere, they're very predictable and they're thus boring, because if they're just 100% certain they're going to be on one side of things all the time, it's just not that interesting. But I want to get us started off by, just for people that don't know, and some people watching, I imagine a lot might be familiar with your content, but for anyone that's not, I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about kind of your story and what made you want to start making the content that you make, particularly on YouTube.
How did I start doing YouTube? I understood that YouTube was a thing, and every once in a while I would check out videos on YouTube prior to the spring of 2017. I guess I found Jordan Peterson on there before he became Jordan Peterson that we know right now, when he was just a frumpy college professor, which is probably my favorite, Jordan Peterson. Watched a lot of him, actually I used it a lot for supplementing my education by listening to lectures, specifically like academics talking about literature, politics or whatever like that. I didn't really understand it as a public forum so much, or a place where independent creators can, just kind of craft their own punditry out of, webcam and material, until events transpired around me at the Evergreen State College in the spring of 2017, which was all live streamed onto the internet. And that particular content or material was rife for YouTube commentary. And I watched as these YouTube commenters took the material that my college produced for them, or the students at my college produced for them, and then the YouTube commenters made hay with that. And they gave insights, or they did mocking things, or they told the story, and you didn't see that story being told. I didn't see that story being told or covered in the press that well. And while I was watching all that content be discussed, I'm like, well, you guys aren't really understanding what's going on. So I'm like, okay, let me come down here. Let's swoop down in here. I think there was some kid or some young man close to Evergreen who wasn't actually at Evergreen, but had attended Evergreen years before then. He was commenting every day, and he was getting a lot of views, and people were really paying attention to him. I'm like, well, he's not even telling the story itself. Why don't I do that? And so I just started pressing record on my handy dandy China-built, Apple-designed smartphone. And I was in the basement. I was at work at Evergreen State College, and I just started trying to speak my truth of the events. And I say that my truth, both ironically but seriously, because my first video was me telling the story from my point of view and not even discussing the events, but discussing why they happened and really what the students had been taught and what the teachers and the administrators, the professors had been teaching the students. And then following that, all of a sudden I have thousands of people watching me. I'm like, well, I got to do another one. And I also understood that the college had produced all these videos of all these work sessions. So I'm like, well, tippy tippy, let's find those things, download them, and publish them. And that combined with all the emails that I had access to and the firsthand experience that I had access to just launched me into being a pundit. And I graduated right then. So every day I produced a video for months and months and months. It just kind of fell into my lap and I ran with it because I had been a marginalized figure in my own life for a really long time, pining for attention, like real attention, not just selfies and likes, but really a longing to have an audience and to provide an audience with quality material. And all of a sudden, here was my opportunity, so I just ran with it.
Yeah, I want to recommend your content to anyone listening. If people want to learn more about the background and things that precipitated the Evergreen, I always just kind of call it the meltdown. You and Mike Nana are always the two people that I mention
Yeah.
in that respect. I mean, this was something that, of course, Dave Rubin jumped all over it. Joe Rogan was interested in it. And as much as I think those are perfectly good interviews, actually, with Brett Weinstein, I think that some of the work that you have done and also that Mike Nana did is really, really, there are things that I actually regularly send to people as I'm kind of trying to introduce them to some of the worst aspects of what kind of woke, let's call it intersectionality and this form of identity politics can do, because I consider Evergreen to kind of be a great example of like, this is one of the worst things, and one of the things I think as I have found is most convincing is just introducing people to this event that they may not have heard of previously. And I've actually had people go, I had no idea something like this could happen. I want to ask you, we've seen particularly in the last like 6 months, but to a certain extent, even before Evergreen, well, not before Evergreen, but particularly in the past 6 months, it seems like there's been what I've heard Weinstein refer to as like the Evergreening of America, and sort of this realization of the fact that Evergreen was a sign of something much bigger. And of course, there were the people trying to make that clear, no one more than Brett Weinstein himself, and a lot of people ignoring that, including some very smart people who've since kind of recanted. Matt Taibbi is a great example of somebody who for a long time was like, oh, wokeness is on the fringes, it's going to be on college campuses. Ended up, after the events of last summer, kind of going back on that. To what extent do you think Evergreen was a microcosm of the sort of broader kind of woke takeover of our institutions, and it's kind of a meltdown that we're experiencing in the worlds of tech, academia, media, and government?
Well, it's for anybody listening, please take this with a grain of salt. I want to dash salt over what I'm about to say, because when I think it was in May for the third anniversary of Brett Weinstein getting protested outside of his classroom on May 23rd, 2017, so May 23rd, 2020, I had him on the channel and we interviewed each other. We talked about the events. We talked about the significance of their events. We talked about, the future. And then 1 week or 2 weeks later, the Floyd thing happens. The actual man, rest in peace. The events that happened after him are a whole other different story. What that video footage of George Floyd dying did is different than what it showed. So when that happened, and then the protest erupted across the Northwest. So I'm sandwiched between Portland and Seattle, and so Portland's had constant since that time, just nightly, like some sort of party of destruction every night. Seattle had its fun time where they part of their 5 or 6 blocks of their city got taken over by Chaz, or they had that autonomous zone. So there was actually a literal insurrection where people tried to set up their own government or whatever, to whatever extent, and they were allowed to do that. And then, of course, who gets killed in that event? But when that stuff started happening, I went into panic mode. I was like, I like had like this serious kind of, okay, not serious. I don't know how serious. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't really know or understand what PTSD is. So I don't want to claim that. It doesn't matter anymore because the word is basically just applied to anything
Yeah.
from stubbing your toe to having a nose at this point. But I was kind of overtaken by, oh my God, what's going to happen, and not just because of the protests, because I saw what happens behind the protest, what happens underneath the protest, what happens in the cover of the protest is that I saw this critical race theory stuff, all these brochures and all of these articles that I'd been critiquing since I saw what happened at Evergreen in front of me. And since I saw what happened to cause Evergreen, I saw all that stuff being slated in through bureaucracy. And that anti-racism stuff, the Robin DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi, so-called anti-racism stuff, which I contend is some of the most racist stuff that we've
Absolutely.
seen openly in decades, and there's reasons for that. So when 2020 happened, I'm like, oh my God, this is like the Evergreening of America. And I actually had Mike Nina and James Lindsay on my channel right at the beginning of that to talk about that. I also had Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Pajot, who are both critics of the woke movement. And I don't want to peg them either, but they've both been invested in the discussions that I've been invested in. Specifically, Vanderklay and Pajot are religious kind of scholars. So
Mhm.
they attack or they dismantle these ideas comparatively to religion, which is a very popular way of understanding what wokeness is. Whereas
Yeah.
James Lindsay and Mike Nina are coming at it from a more academic perspective, a line of attack. And me, I'm coming at it from a narrative perspective, which is kind of somewhere between the theory, critical stuff, and the religious stuff, because it's basically about how stories function and how they cause people to behave, how they make sense of our world, and then how they precipitate action and certain sorts of behavior. So, long story short, what happened at the Evergreen State College, I think, is relevant. I talk about it. I try not to talk about it too much because I've been talking about it for almost 4 years now, at least on my channel. I don't want to I think it is, the story itself is kind of long in the tooth, except it keeps on being relevant. And the documents, the emails that come out of Evergreen mirror perfectly the responses to different sorts of political action, radical political action from the media and from other tiers, other elite institutions. Evergreen models behavior that we see on a much larger scale, both on the level of the institution and on the level of that actual protest. The protest footage that I've compiled in my 22 episode documentary, it's the protest footage, the actual stuff that happened on the ground during that 1 week of protest is absolutely over the top. It's the most over the top stuff. It's very dramatic and even traumatic. If you're watching, you're like, I can't believe that they actually acted like that. But
Mm.
for me, the real story's always been the institution and the ideas that are animating that behavior. And I see that those ideas are alive and well, and they do scale. They scale up from a college campus to a country. So,
Yeah, it seemed to me that the rhythm of what happened and the
hmm,
tactics behind it were eerily similar. And to elaborate on that, I would say it felt as though there was a catalyzing event, which in both cases, to different degrees, is decontextualized and recontextualized, right?
yeah,
Particularly in the case of Evergreen. And then it seems like there are actors lying in wait to
yeah,
sort of close ranks and go, here's an opportunity to feast. Like there's like it has
mm,
this feel almost metaphorically of like somebody sees a wounded animal, whether that's, I don't know, maybe in the metaphor that's liberalism, that's the institution of Evergreen College or of the United States, the things that uphold these institutions. And
mm,
they go, they're vulnerable because they've given us an opportunity to decontextualize something that people are very sensitive to. Because anything that has to do with race, and
mm,
the day of absence situation with Brett obviously had to do with race. He wasn't doing anything racist, but race was a factor.
mm,
George Floyd, that situation, a little more complicated, I would say. And it seems like the thing that seems so eerily similar is that kind of lying in wait factor. Like things happened so quickly. When I said rhythm, what I meant is things happened so quickly and so up tempo. Like all of a sudden there was this avalanche after George Floyd, and on a smaller scale there was an avalanche at Evergreen after Brett's email regarding day of absence. That it's like there's almost an element of planning, and I think that that is one of the most kind of disturbing aspects.
I need to clarify a point. The day of absence thing was tacked on to what happened. Even Brett Weinstein was tacked on to what the students actually planned. They had formed an event out of the lie that two students of color, so-called, as they say, were so-called detained by the campus police. That event didn't happen. Something happened, but they made hay out of that into showing that the authority of Evergreen is oppressing the black body, which is the trigger for this event. And that is baked into the activism. So there are a certain number of conditions that trigger this response. And that response is, it's followed through on by, there are certain actors, there's certain infrastructure of activist nature to get out the word, but there's also a culture within a certain generation, but it's also shared across generations, of what we basically call wokeness, of a certain sanctity towards certain identities and a certain willingness to, I don't want to say overreact, but to react very strongly to the violation of these sacred bodies or these sacred symbols. And so with regards to what happened at Evergreen, there was the detaining of two students of color with regards to George Floyd, and then the guy in, I'm sorry, Jacob Blake. Again, black body gets violated specifically by the police. So you can ignore all the black bodies being treated like bodies by other black bodies. And I'm sorry to use that language. That's the language taken
Yeah,
from
it's they
the wokeness
it's what
stuff.
they
But
say. Yeah.
the crime rate, the black on black crime rate doesn't cause anything to happen. If one police officer has a bad event with a black person, though, that leads to shooting or some sort of violence, it doesn't matter even how in the wrong the black person was, it just triggers that whole thing. And that has been in the works for a really long time. So there's a cultural, there's like this program that's lurking in people's heads. And so I just wanted to push against you. There are activists that are ready and willing to pounce on that, but there is this programming that snaps everybody into place. And that's why those protests over last summer were so big, and why city after city, specifically Democrat cities, were overtaken. And then the riots were, of course, allowed to go basically unchecked, which is just what happened at Evergreen, at the Evergreen State College, when the protest went critical and they started taking hostages and shutting down buildings, the protesters. The administration called off the police. And you see a lot of that in what happened in 2020, where there's apologies or there's this bowing down to this crowd. It's not even to the crowd, it's to the symbol. There's this, I really think that civil rights has become some sort of religion that's entered a decadent phase.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the stuff that's going on isn't necessarily individuals acting. It's this whole programming, it's this whole cultural conditioning that's been going on. And I don't even think it was intentional. I even have doubts about this being some sort of Soviet psyop from 40 years ago. I think it's just like how these ideas of progressivism have just slowly transformed how we think of the individual and how we think of identity.
No, I think that's a very valid point and a valid pushback, because one thing that I want to emphasize, and I would agree with you on, is this is essentially sort of a leaderless phenomenon or movement. I don't know what the right word would be. And I think
Kind of
program is a
rudderless
good,
too.
yeah, rudderless and leaderless. And that's one of the scariest things about it. Can't be reasoned with, right? If there's actual individuals, which I sort of made it sound like there was, right, in the planning, in the lying in wait aspect, you think like, oh, well, that means somebody is organizing that process, right? And people might think there's some other reason.
There are vestiges of organization, but that
Oh,
doesn't
definitely.
explain the scale of these events.
No, and I think actually, putting it on the scale of a religion, I think is one of the strongest ways to kind of explain why it's simply so influential and so powerful, and how it can work so quickly. Is that, and
Hmm.
also, what have we seen in recent decades? The weakening of classical religions, of
Hmm.
Christianity in particular. And there's just sort of the replacement theory. I'm not certainly not the first person to say it. I remember Douglas Murray
Yeah.
was talking about it years back of,
Yeah.
we lose our initial religious values, particularly Judeo-Christian, and then we see immediately it's replaced. And that leads me to another question I wanted to ask you, which is that, let's go with the hypothesis that this is a, religious phenomenon on some level.
Mm.
Is and let's maybe also go with the assumption that people sort of inevitably seek and desire a certain degree of religious structure or thinking to their social lives, to their personal value structure. If that is the case, then is the only way to combat this religion with another religion? Like, is there any way to circumvent sort of religious processes and tactics? Or do we simply need to come up with a more appealing and persuasive religion to sort of win the day in a direct conflict with the one that we've seen kind of ravaging our society?
I'll go back to my first video about Evergreen. I said that this isn't something that you can argue against because it's not built out of argument. I think it's more
Mm.
built out of a narrative. It's built out of a structure that precedes argument. So if you think of a story, you can have philosophy in a story if you have two characters that are talking philosophy. Right. If you try to make a story that's a philosophical story, it doesn't really work as a story. It's not really juicy. It's not really fun. So you can intentionally try to devise a story. And if you're really clever, you can make a fable, or you can make something with a specific meaning, or you can have something with vestiges of philosophy like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But the story itself is a story. And if it's going to be a good story, you don't design it as a philosophy. You can have philosophy in it, which is contained, and you can even have philosophy that grows out of the mechanisms of the story. But the story isn't there to serve the philosophy. The philosophy happens inside of the story. So I think that a lot of there's this background radiation, or there's this field of this there's this playground or this field where this stuff is playing out, where these ideas, where this behavior is playing out, and there's different arguments that you could go through, and you can analyze social justice ideology, you can analyze wokeness by the language that they use, by the way that they treat words. It's very fascinating how they do that. And there is certain analogs to fundamentalist or puritanical viewpoint towards certain codes that you say, like the idea of a virtue signal is basically you're repeating a mantra which ties you into a domain, and then you have status and meaning in that domain. So certain parts of that status meaning kind of hydraulics is like some of it's personal meaning, but some of it's like social meaning. And having that virtue signal, they're designed, these woke virtue signals are designed to make you feel compassion, to make you perform compassion. It's like if you force yourself to smile, you'll be happy. So if you force yourself to say 1,000 times that you care about this or that cause, then you feel like you care. So there's that part, but it also ties into you're part of a movement. What was the exact question? We were working to
I
the
mean,
religious.
basically,
So how do we
the
fight it with a religion, right?
or basically, do you think there is any way to fight this without coming up with sort of an alternative religion or value structure? Because some people, like maybe Sam Harris, would say, I don't like any religious thinking, I don't
Yeah.
want it, get rid of it. And I
Yeah.
love Sam Harris, but I don't mean to misrepresent him, but that's my, that's a very low resolution version maybe of the kind of things he
Yeah.
says. And
Yeah.
so basically
Continue.
just asking, do you think there's any way to fight it without, and maybe to put it more in your terms of a narrative, is there any way to fight it without coming up with just another story that is more compelling, that is more appealing? Because I love actually you structuring it as narrative and story, because there's definitely an obvious and clear story being told. The story is there are the civil rights activists, right? This is a story that we were all taught in school, and thank God we are. I think it's valid that we're taught it, but it does kind of have an impact where we think of the protesters are the good guys, the cops are the bad guys. That is kind of established at a very young age to a
Yeah.
certain extent. And
Yeah.
depending on where you are, you might be told the cops can sometimes be the good guys too, but maybe not. But in any case, you're really given kind of a rebels versus evil empire look into politics and philosophy, where there, and civil rights is sort of the skeleton of the narrative. Is there's people
Yeah.
fighting for the rights of minorities in particular
Yeah.
against a majority, and that's a really appealing narrative and a really hard one to break free from, because there's just so much stock put into
Yeah.
by this phenomenon, race, as something that you cannot nuance at all. It always has to be
It's
one
really
side is good, one
dangerous
side is
too.
bad. Yeah.
There's
So is there
there's
any way
a
to come up with a more appealing story, or is there an alternative to doing that?
You know, you bring up that fighting narrative, and that explains there's this one rhetorical trick that shuts down the discourse where somebody says, I can't argue with somebody who's against my very existence, right? So it's like you're
Right.
either on their
Always.
side or you want to be some sort of antimatter gun. It's
You're
like
Darth Vader. Yeah.
there's
It's yeah.
nowhere to go with that. So the problem, though, like you bring up with Sam Harris, and I think of atheists specifically, they're never going to jump on board with another religion. Absolutely not. And plus, there's problems with having religion because there's the holy text, the religion, and then there's all the denominations. So we're in a time where we could encourage and argue for a religious understanding. And I think that there's certain thinkers, namely Jordan Peterson, has been very effective in showing that there is a way to take religion seriously and to use it as a vehicle for finding meaning in your life. There's also, there's so many different problems that we're experiencing, like our atomization, being in a capitalist, individualist society. And you see that a lot in identity, where your identity is basically your personal brand. And that's why, addended to this racial conversation, which is very rigid, there's this whole like nest of values in this racial identity thing. But then if you plug in gender, then you're like, okay, well, I can start, like, at least I have more room. You know, I can play around with my masculinity and my femininity, and I can put on makeup now, or I can wear pants or whatever, you know, and then that's a part of my identity. That's part of my brand. So there's that. Then there's the disconnection with any sort of sense of history. And I'm not just talking about knowledge of history, but our personal history. Like, who knows their grandparents? Who knows anything about their great grandparents? Who is thinking towards their grandchildren? Who goes through on a Saturday night? I'm taking this from Joshua Mitchell, who's probably, yeah, I think it's Joshua Mitchell, who goes out on a Saturday night and thinks, well, what will my grandparents say? What will my grandchildren say about what I'm doing right now? You know, sending a dick pic on Tinder or whatever, right? We have no sense of connection to our own lineage. And there's that. And then we have no sense of patriotic understanding of America. And we go back to the narrative and what you saw, and I put this in the documentary before it became as big of a deal as it ended up becoming, the 1619 Project, which is just a blatant move to redesign the entire American project around slavery, making slavery our defining attribute. And that it's going so far where you can't even say, okay, slavery is something that happened in America, and it is something that we need to deal with, and we are constantly dealing with it, and we will never be free from that history until we somehow find a resolution in there. And you can't even, that's not even on the table there. It's like, no, everything in America is defined by the treatment of one race by another race. And it doesn't matter how tangentially you were or your ancestors were connected to that. Like, that is the main definition. So everything's up for grabs. And that's kind of a postmodern argument that I don't want to get into because I always lose my way, and I'm too postmodern to even explain postmodernism. But so on a number of different levels, we are lacking stability. Religious framework, or even a pre-religious framework, even just an understanding that as a society, we can't really function without some sort of narrative that gives us a value between the sacred and the profane, gives us a value between the guilty and the innocent, and has a functional path towards redemption. Without that, we have these pernicious ideologies that say that they're not religion. And if you actually look at the history of wokeness, one of its first playing grounds was the atheist community. What happened in the atheist community is actually, after they kind of detached themselves from arguing with Christians, they adopted a moral framework that was puritanically implemented by themselves. And there's all this purity politic going on. And they're not even aware that, oh, if they had a structure where there was some path towards forgiveness. There was some sort of story with an ideal male and an ideal female, like a Jesus and a Mary, that connects us to our biological function, that connects us to our roles socially, that connects us to infinity and to the present. And so I don't know how to design something like that, but I really do think, my hope is that wokeness is so terrible at telling stories and making art that eventually young people are just going to say, screw this, I'm going to do something fun, because this is not fun. It's meaningful, but it's not fun. And it doesn't even actually mean anything because I'm just parroting what everybody else is saying. So I'm not even being me. I have an identity, but who the fuck cares about an identity? Sorry for dropping the F-bomb.
No, you
So
can curse on this show, and I do it sometimes too.
there is a path, but you have to think that, a lot of people are going to hate anything that's religious in nature, even as they are watching this anti-religion or this religious thing engulf everything without having a pushback. So it's a really good question. It's a huge project, though. It's a huge project.
I'm kind of getting this image in my head though of like if you sneak, and kids hate it when you do this, but if you sneak a little bit of cauliflower into the mac and cheese, and what I mean by that is like, let's say hypothetically religion is good for you, and that's an assumption, right? But let's assume that for a minute.
Yeah, like cauliflower.
Right, like cauliflower.
It's like white broccoli. It's like
or whatever it might be.
No, you picked the correct one. I'm having a physical revulsion to that mac and cheese, but come on, sell it to me.
I wouldn't
Pitch
eat
it, buddy.
Either. But in any case, let's say hypothetically it's good for you, right? And what I'm thinking is, I think, because I'm actually very much cut from the cloth of the atheist community. I am an atheist, although my opinions on religion have softened considerably. And you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned Jordan Peterson. He's been I sort of went from being anti-theist to regular old atheist because in large part to people like Jordan Peterson. And actually, I got to give Ben Shapiro a shout out for that as well, as a Jewish atheist, or ethnically Jewish atheist, to be more clear. But in any case, I can definitely say from my experience, at least, that there's less so an aversion to religion. And you don't realize this when you first start kind of becoming an atheist, if you're like I was, an edgy atheist teenager. You don't realize that you don't have so much an aversion to religion. You have an aversion to the idea of God as he is defined by many religious people. And I think that if you remove that aspect, or you disguise it in some way, the cauliflower and the mac and cheese, I mean, you could say that American patriotism, which many atheists do have, Sam Harris, I think on some level has it, is a religion. The Constitution is the holy book on some level. God is kind of split up into these personalities of Ben Franklin, George Washington. When you're a kid, you're taught about these otherworldly, amazing people who created a country. And you end up giving people a value structure that I maintained when I became an atheist. I still liked America. I never became an anti-American, kind of progressive who hates America. I did become very progressive, and that was part of my search for, I think, more kind of religious value structure. But in any case, I do think there's a way. You said that you don't think, atheists will ever get on board with an alternative religion, but I think that there's actually been some progress in this area. I think that Sam Harris, I keep bringing him up, but he's just one of the best examples, is somebody who I think has softened much in the way I have in his views on religion through the best thing in the world, dialogue. I mean, he's been talking to Jordan Peterson in really fascinating conversations for a number of years now. And so I actually think there's some potential. It can't have a God. I don't think it can't be like there's a God and it's a lot like Christianity, because then there's that allergy where they just go, I don't like that. But I think that if you probably wouldn't even call it religion. It's a value structure of some kind that everyone on some level wants to have. As somebody who kind of shedded my, Judeo-Christian values as a little Jewish boy, I inevitably ended up a progressive because that was the most obvious kind of,
Why?
new value structure for me. What did you say?
Why? Because it was imminent. It was something.
It was, what it was. Good. It's sort of, I guess, I developed an anti-religious set of values in being an atheist, and it seemed to me that there were two choices of what I could be politically, and the liberals and the leftists were the sort of atheist group where I was sort of, and I was in a very conservative Christian area, and I didn't ever really consider that I could be a conservative or a centrist and be an atheist. And this is, by the way, I'm about to turn 26, so this is at a time where it was very difficult to be atheist and anywhere near the right or the center. It actually, especially in my area, it just wasn't socially feasible. But in any case, my point is kind of that I actually think there's potential here on a sort of optimistic note. I think that you have to really think about it hard, and then a lot of work has to be done to, is it even going to be called religion? Is there going to be a God or a godlike figure? But I think that you actually can have, and we have these old values which are good. We love free speech and all that. And if you just sort of adapt it to the enemy of reason that we now face in this sort of woke thing, and also the technological advancements that have completely changed human existence. I mean, the internet has to have a clause in whatever religious text is next. And I really do believe that. I'm a big supporter of like Internet Bill of Rights. People sleep on the impact that the internet has had on human existence. But in any case, I'm rambling a bit.
We're slowly waking up to that one.
Yeah.
That nightmare.
Yeah.
You can't get away from it, because in order, again, it comes from me, is my bias, very explicit though, so I can have it, is that a narrative is a way of encapsulating knowledge and transmitting knowledge from person to person experientially. It is set up in such a way as that it models how we actually live, and you have a sense of whether it's believable or not believable. Coleridge, which was a opium smoking poet back in the Romantic period, he spoke about fiction, or the operative action of engaging in fiction as this willful suspension of disbelief. And I think he totally got it wrong. It's that a good story, taunts you to invest your belief into it. So if we're going to package information from one person to another, from one generation to another, inevitably will start to use stories. And those stories, once they become canonical, will become the sacred text, like the Avengers 10-gilogy, or however you say it, decalogy or whatever. Eventually that you go back down into talking about gods and demons, superheroes and supervillains. It eventually goes back into a sort of polytheistic thing. Now you can have a refined relationship to the story. And you see, like, a 4-year-old kid will start to dress like the Hulk. And when he puts on those masks, he starts acting that out. He starts acting out his aggression, and he starts playing around with that two-sided nature of the Hulk. Very smart, very aggressive. Or any given superhero kind of talks about an aspect of if it's a good story, it talks about an aspect of human becoming or just human nature. And it gets that across in such a way that a 4-year-old can interact with it and not know what he's doing, but really understand himself through that story, all the way up into somebody who is an edgy 16-year-old saying, okay, well, here's all the different meanings of it. And that's the cool thing about Jung and then Peterson in his way. Because these stories, our relationship to the stories can be playful. And you actually can arrange these things and have a conversation, have a dialogue with these stories, and then start to see things about your life that actually, the cool thing about the Bible lectures that Peterson gave is that he's resuscitating this ancient text to a whole new generation, people who don't go to church, never wanted to go to church, completely allergic to church. And he's now tying their imagination to the imagination of people thousands of years ago. So you start to have, through that story, through that transmission of these ancient stories into the modern context, you start to have this slowly, edging the awareness of where we are as part of this long tradition. And then with that comes the responsibility, not just of cleaning your room, but of forwarding and protecting this value structure, this Western civilization. And then start saying, okay, well, these other ideas are going to come in and just want me to tear it down. Now I have a basis of saying, okay, well, what are you going to replace it with? Because now I have all this value out of my culture. I see that there's problems, but what are you going to give me in return for dismantling these things? It starts to cause us to do more cost analysis with the destructive aspects of deconstructive intersectionality.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think the endeavor of building an alternative value structure, because I think a big part of what's been happening is people have been saying, like, classical liberalism, we'll just use that, like it'll work, I promise. And it seems to be doing poorly in this sort of, it's not working very well. And I think that Needless to say, I think we could do hours and hours on it. People like us who are interested in these things have got our work cut out for us in,
Oh yeah.
I think, dissecting this very core question. But I want to, on the note of stories, kind of transition to a different topic that I really want to
Mm.
ask you about, because you're an artist, you're somebody who's interested in literature and poetry, and you even created your own major at Evergreen College, narrative arts, which is something I could have seen myself doing. I'm also have an artistic side myself, and I wanted to ask you about the overwhelming influence that we have seen of, let's just call it wokeness. It goes by many names. I like to call it woke supremacy sometimes.
Yeah.
But I, uh, I wanted to ask about the overwhelming influence we've seen of this ideology, phenomenon, movement, whatever you want to call it, on our art and our entertainment and our culture. I mean, my girlfriend, she reads a lot more than me. She's super into just novels and young adult fiction. And she said even there where
Yeah.
I'm not as well versed, huge impact. Whereas I'm more into like video games,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
sports, movies, and of course I've seen the influence there. And it
Yeah.
seems like nothing is safe. As someone who's interested in art and particularly literature, it would seem. Just what are your general feelings and thoughts on what we're seeing, and could you ever see it reversing? Because it's been insufferable, to be very frank. I mean, it's just, as time has gone on, it seems to get worse and worse, to where I'm just, I'm flipping through the options in Netflix or whatever, and I'm going, man, it really is everywhere. It's in every little
Yeah.
nook and cranny.
Yeah. Yeah. Eventually the market will correct that. Eventually
Yeah.
people will get tired of getting it's like, okay, we don't have churches anymore. Now everything is church. Now we're like
Yeah.
all worshiping at the altar of identity. Like, in our entire liturgical calendar, instead of having Christmas and Easter, now we have Black Day, Indigenous Day, Hispanic Day, no White Day, because every day is White Day. But we have an Irish Day. Everything's like this huge like identity calendar. Like that's our church now. So instead of having it contained with a cool story that you can create thousands of years of art out of, like the Europe did, and like other traditions like Buddhism and these other generative religions have laid the groundwork for all this artistic expression, because you can variate the human experience with those stories. You just have this, okay, now we're going to have this identity thing. And you kind of know that there's going to be some sort of weird, like meaning in there is going to make you feel bad for this person and bad at that person, and the levers of it. And then you get into comics, you get into Gamergate, you get into the knitting community, the YA community,
Comedy, I should have mentioned. Yeah, that's one that I'm
comedy
pretty.
too. So I've done a lot of analysis on how this ideology infiltrates and influences, takes over, and then corrupts all these different
Yeah.
societies. But then how does it affect the actual outcome? The product of those societies, a completely different question. And the thing is that it captured our institutions. So if you want to live off of grants, you're going to have to honk the bourgeois, the corrupt bourgeois religion, anti-racism, wokeness horn. It just became a status symbol for people to get off on feeling good about themselves. And then the artists come up and they're willing to pimp themselves out, or they're believers too, and then they go along with this. So you have all this crappy art in the art realm, fine art realm. It's all there. But ultimately, there's no reason for it to have more power than it already does. It takes the institutions such as Amazon and Netflix and all those people, they'll pander to it, but eventually they're not going to have the numbers that they want, and they'll go back to playing things that people want to. So you actually have to vote with your dollar and just pick it, or boycott crap. We have to actually boycott crap. The problem is that we have this whole generation that's been educated pretty damn poorly. So how do you inspire taste and inspire curiosity and hunger for the beautiful and the great and and real suffering, like art, like real suffering that is not tied to this lame identity, historic right side of history rhetoric, but like real human suffering will break through that. The stories of real human suffering, real joy will always win. It will win eventually. So I don't really care. I mean, I'm somebody though who decided or realized very early in my pursuit of my project that nobody would read it until after I was dead. Like, I wasn't writing for anybody living. I wasn't writing for any, I pined for recognition, like I said
Mm.
earlier, but I kind of, by the time I graduated Evergreen, about 2 months before I graduated, I finished my project, like my 700-page thesis on narrative arts. And I was in the shower. I'm like, I'm done. That whole life, that whole fictional life of writing fiction is done. I'm free. I don't exist anymore because I built so much my ego out of it, but I'm done. I let go of that. So I'm not really pining for recognition artistically myself. And I think other people that will toward recognition will drive people to create good art, despite it not being politically correct. And the will toward beauty will drive consumers towards stuff that's good. You can only, the only reason they have so much power is because they captured freaking institutions that are filled with a bunch of bureaucrats. That's all it is. It's all it is. I mean, it's really terrible when you get into like federal government. Like, there's some stuff
Yeah.
we have to like fight against, like our news media is totally corrupt and there's a lot of bad things, but with it, when it comes down to reality, it doesn't stand up. It's not good artistically.
Yeah, no, I think that media, whether it's news media or entertainment media, is where I have some optimism in that there's a very direct form of competition, and
Yeah.
that's the internet and all the myriad versions of independent creation, which, have made Joe Rogan more influential in many ways
Yeah.
than Wolf Blitzer, certainly among my generation for sure.
Well, as long
So
as we keep YouTube and these other content platforms from, we have to fight for those. We have to
we
fight
really
for.
do. And that is a frightening thing that just the past few weeks has become more distressing, certainly. But I mean, yeah, the idea that the market will correct, we've seen some evidence of that in that certain very obviously kind of woke pandering pieces of entertainment, especially in the movie industry, will fail pretty hard. We saw that kind of happening to the Star Wars franchise. That one hurt me a lot. I'm a Star
Kind of.
Wars fan. It really happening to the Star Wars
like
franchise.
that was like a
And then what was
smackdown
that Harley
epic.
Quinn movie? But
Yeah.
I think that sometimes they're really good at, this is kind of a reversal of my metaphor from before. I'm going to make you gag again with the cauliflower and the
The
mac and cheese,
cauliflower.
because to
Okay.
them the cauliflower is the wokeness, right? And I think that sometimes they're pretty good at disguising it really, really well, or at least not even really, really well, just a little. Because the cases I think where they've failed is where they're not even trying. Like, they're just, with it's the Last Jedi or it's the Harley Quinn movie, there's just no attempt to even slightly hide the like overt identity politics overtones. I don't, you can't even call them undertones. And so people do turn, and it's the go woke go broke situation. I think that when they just hide it a little teensy weensy bit, when they just put minimal effort into hiding it, the cauliflower and the mac and cheese, that it actually, there hasn't been a lot of failure. I mean, I actually think that there have
Yeah,
been,
just like
I don't know, it's like,
Antifa. Like, how can you be against Antifa? Like,
and
they're
that's
against
such a
fascists. Like,
simple rhetorical trick that like 90% of people should be able to. But yeah, no, it's like that minimal level of effort of cleverness, if you would even call it that, seems to be pretty effective. And I guess I just sort of hope people continue to wise up, because it seems like, I don't know, I think the jury's still out on whether or not the market will really correct, and we could see kind of a resurgence of art that is not overtly, kind of overtaken with this stuff. um I don't know,
the
I'm kind of have two minds about it.
the thing is that we're always going to have people who are puritanical. We're always going to have a fundamentalist mass. We're always going to have humorless people. We're always going to have bureaucrats. We're always going to have people with bipolar disorder. We're always going to have really intense narcissists, borderline personality. We're always going to have these aspects of these personality traits that wokeness amplifies, kind of creates and amplifies. The problem with wokeness, to reverse engineer it, is that it gives the narcissist power, it gives the bureaucrat power, it gives the humorless
Mhm.
ideologue power, it gives the fundamentalist Puritan power, it gives the it empowers that which we will never get away from, but we can, other systems can suppress. Like, and so the question is, how do we put those people in their place where their drives be they maladaptive or unbecoming or what, are still in service of the beautiful and in service of the true and in service of the good. That's the thing. So we kind of have to, wake up that middle who's just plodding along. Okay, I don't want to be racist, so I'll go to this seminar, and I don't want to be sexist, so I'll go to this thing and I'll consume this media. And the people in these businesses who are like, I have a lot of problems with this, but I can't lose my job. We have to somehow make a movement where it's okay for them to shut down the assholes that are driving us over the edge. And the assholes, let's be true here, are both they're across the spectrum. They're across
Hmm.
the spectrum
Yeah.
politically. But we just need that center, and that's the problem, I guess, with the way that things have shaped up right now with wokeness. Wokeness is and the rhetoric through the Trump era of you're either with us or you're for locking kids in cages, right? This absolutism, full throttle or full stop. That they're just we need more wiggle room somehow.
Yeah, I think that it I think this will reflect a bit of kind of what you were saying, is that it does seem to empower, and this is something very dangerous. It empowers narcissism and narcissistic behavior, and behavior that is very much bad for people's personal development and is a
Yeah,
telltale sign of poor personal and emotional development. And this leads to something I wanted to ask you about, because you were a preschool teacher at one point, right?
yeah,
Uh,
about a
yeah,
decade or
and I
so.
wanted to ask you, I mean, in doing so, you were somebody who spent a lot of time helping young children sort of learn to be people, giving
Yeah,
them a sense of etiquette and civility and empathy.
yeah.
And in
Well, they
doing
say,
so,
those who can do, those who can't teach. So make of that what you will. With me being in preschool
no, but
for
it,
so long.
you know, it, it's important stuff, I say, because, what I've seen with wokeness, and I wanted to ask you about this, is it seems to be something that incentivizes bad behavior, including in children, and it incentivizes them acting childish and
Yeah,
throwing tantrums. And it seems to do this very disturbing thing where it not only stunts young people's emotional and social and intellectual growth, it can actually make adults regress. It makes adults
yeah,
say, I haven't thrown a tantrum in a long time, but it seems like for the first time in a long time, I can and should
yeah.
throw a tantrum if I want what I want. And it takes somebody with a really kind of high level of cognition going on to recognize what they're being incentivized to do. And I
Hmm.
wanted to ask you, I mean, what do you make of this sort of developmental regression as somebody who spent time with young children trying to help them progress?
Yeah,
What do you think of that?
yeah. I think I wrote a tweet about that got some legs to it. Like I spent 10 years trying to teach children to act like adults, and then I went to a college that was teaching adults to act like children or something like that.
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
was something
It's a
crazy
good way to put it.
at Evergreen. And before the big meltdown happened, I witnessed firsthand a number of protests, and I was just absolutely incensed. There's a word. I was just like aghast and like
Yeah.
go up to my supervisor, I even wrote a letter to George Bridges. And I'm
Mhm.
saying the behavior that these kids or these young adults are exhibiting is not correct. And it comes from this stupid idea of privilege and oppression, which displaces all personal responsibility onto the system. So they no longer have to examine their own behavior and everything's okay. So they can go up and do violent things to different people and just completely go off the handle. I warn them, like, what are you teaching? What are you
Yeah.
teaching these people? It's going backwards. And and so, in the thick of things, that's how I felt. But when you're trying to get people to recognize that that is what is being that is how they're operating, that's how they are starting to think, and that's that their feelings of feeling bad, their feelings of being oppressed, their feelings of needing to break out and to overthrow and to smash the man come from this consciousness, this narrative that is causing them to see everything in a certain lens of privilege and oppression and privilege and oppression. And that's why I hate that this is being taught to children, that our whole
Yeah.
generation is being taught by these well-meaning, and I really put strong quotes around that,
Mhm.
teachers and administrators to divide everybody up by race, assign them all these points, displace their own ability to grow, to move through the world, to be responsible onto the system, because the system can fix it. The system can fix it. And so the system is going to then incentivize them to relinquish more and more of their individuality and their money and their time and their freedom to this state that will go around and cause equity to happen. Which is not a pretty idea. Equity is just equalization. So we're gonna tamp down all the white male. We're gonna send all
Yeah.
the white men into the woods, and then every time they poke out of the woods, we're gonna go into a hissy fit. Oh my God, the white men are coming! The white men are coming! Get back there into your hidey hole. And then everybody else is gonna live in this beautiful world of having equal resources. I don't know. That's the whole communist thing, but it just seems like the whole generation, because of this idea of privilege and oppression, if you work out the math on privilege and oppression, where does it lead? It leads to everybody trusting a computer or some sort to give us a final analysis. So there is a God right there, but there's this God of that I can only recognize as some sort of super algorithm that can adequately, to the letter calculate your actual privilege, which includes your humor, which includes your, desire to read, your work ethic. That's a part of your privilege. The whole thing comes tumbling down.
Yeah, I think that to kind of bring it full circle to something you mentioned, it was one of the first things you said today, is that um, if you're going to try and help young people grow by giving them a narrative or a story to kind of tell themselves as they move about the world, and you make it something super rigid and especially super kind of conflict oriented and racially conflict oriented. I mean, you're playing with fire so much. And you mentioned the idea of wiggle room. If you're going to give people a narrative, it has to have wiggle room, because that gives them the power to be individuals and kind of make their story unique. Because right now there's millions upon millions of kind of zombified people whose story is the same. It's, I am the good Rebel Alliance civil rights activist. I'm going to blow up the Death Star, which is white supremacy. I love Star Wars, but that's a fucking shitty narrative. Okay. It has no wiggle room. It's, and actually Star Wars itself has a good amount of wiggle room. Darth Vader redeems himself, but that's just me nerding out. It's like, it's like any good narrative, is going to have some wiggle room and
some sort of change.
I think
and that's why the manifestation of cancel culture and going back through people's tweets for 10 years and stuff, there's no concept of personal development. It's it's an anti-narrative. You can never have a novel because you can never have a growth arc. You're either innocent or you're guilty from the get-go, from the beginning to the end. There's no movement at all. And it's weird. It's like this end of history. It's like they can see the end of history. And so we're going to cancel you. And I know that that's a kind of a straw man, but you can see that operative principle of this disconnection from very basic rudimentary understanding that you would get from actually reading instead of being indoctrinated. So it kind of stacks in that.
And it is just absolutely terrible for people as individuals. I mean, I've actually watched people have personal consequences in their own life. If they go really deep into this thing, I mean, look at the mugshots of Antifa people. I mean, you see people whose personal lives are clearly destroyed by probably a myriad of things, but one factor is certainly their ideological possession. And
doesn't help
not
setting him up for success.
No, and it puts me, I'm kind of in an interesting position in that I'm being born in 95, I'm either considered very young millennial or very old Gen Z. And I sort of grew up not particularly influenced by this thing in a world that, because it really accelerated just the past like 10 years, a whole hell of a lot. And also being in a conservative area, wokeness was not really a part of my life until I went to college, because I started college in 2013. Just by hearing that year, you can probably tell, okay, this guy when he was in college, and you as well, and especially being at Evergreen, perhaps doubly so in your case, all of a sudden at university, and of course, Donald Trump was elected my senior year of college, we see this acceleration. And I sort of, in being born in the reason I mentioned being born in 95, being on the border, I'm using the year that Jonathan Haidt used in Coddling the American Mind as the border year for Gen Z. And by the way, great book that everyone should read. But and it puts me in an interesting position where I find myself, even though I am only 25 and about to turn 26, I look at a generation younger than me and go, holy hell. I mean, we've got it bad enough. When I think of my millennial peers, there is a serious problem. But then I remember that at least we had a period of time during which this thing was not nearly as powerful as it was. Like the internet wasn't even fully commercialized till I was like 12 years old. there was a relatively normal, nice existence I got to have as a child that I'm very grateful for. I think about people who are even 5 years younger than me, and I go like, oh hell, I don't know how they are going to navigate a world in which the internet and this woke thing came into their
Hmm.
lives without any sort of immediately. They were born into it, because even having, for me, it having come into my life really when I was a teenager,
Hmm.
an older teenager, close to college age or in college, I don't know. I think, I guess I'm making this point because there's people who are old enough to where they had already matured into young adults by the time this thing became really a factor, or older adults. I mean, depending on how old you are. And then there's people who are young enough that it's been a part of their life their whole life. And then for me and people who are kind of around my age, it's sort of like there was a, I always, I always tell to my friends, I'm like, do you remember when there were two genders? Because I do. It's like sort of like we sort of watched it happen during our very formative years in a
Yeah.
big way, and it's very jarring, I can say, from a personal perspective, when I think about how things were when I mean, I'm only 25. When I was 19, this is, we're talking 6 years ago, I lived in a totally different universe, and I don't think there are a lot of people that can say that aren't relatively close to me in age. I mean, I know things change, but usually I think it takes a little longer than it has
Yeah. Yeah.
in
No,
recent
yeah, it's
years.
been pretty accelerationist in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. I think that there might be a good deal of work to do for atheists such as yourself who were part of that movement when it was that movement before it went into that other
Yeah.
direction. But specifically, kind of salvaging the techniques that you guys used in order to cause conversations with the fundamentalists or
Hmm.
do inroads with communication
Mm.
and winning rights of freedom or just winning space where religion didn't control the conversation that I think a lot of atheists did. I think there was probably some tools there that could be used to sequester wokeness from certain areas, give people a place where they don't have to be religious, and or the proselytization of wokeness and the enforcement of that belief system is suspended. And I think that atheism probably did some good work in, or classical liberalism did some work of saying, okay, there's this place called secular world where religion and belief is not on the table, where you can have your beliefs, but you can't tell me what to believe. And I think that I have seen arguments to that effect where that's one way of attacking wokeness, at least in the business and the governmental sphere, saying this is actually a religion. And here's something that that's against our values to have a enforced religion, but also underneath that, allowing people who are immersed in it a path out, or a path to just not be in that frame, and kind of get a taste of life outside of the cult. Yeah, maybe there's not as much very explicit meaning in every one of your acts because they're not all good or all evil, but you can breathe a little bit and play around.
Yeah.
You
That's
can
something I
imagine
want to
that.
think about. I look back fondly sometimes on the days of, oh, it was just atheism and Christianity. Man, that was fun. Like back then I thought Christianity was the biggest threat to, reason. Man, I miss when
Reason.
that was the
Yeah.
case. But
Yeah.
I know we blocked out an hour. I just have one more question, really. It's something I like to ask everyone who comes on the show. This show, obviously it has kind of somewhat of a culture war theme, but one of the themes I like to have is actually having some concrete advice for people listening, and strategies and tactics that should be used if they want to
Correct.
fight for truth and reason. So
Yeah.
I want to ask you, Benjamin, what would you recommend to somebody who's kind of in a place mentally where they're like, man, all these terrible things are happening. I want
Yeah.
to be kind of a good representative for reason and truth seeking and all of the good stuff, free speech and all of that. What are maybe some specific things you would say to somebody who's in that position?
I have fielded a lot of people expressing state of mental frailty right now with the
Hmm.
state of U.S. politics,
Mm-hmm.
and they say something to the effect that they're really at the edge or on edge. And I think that everybody needs to have distance between politics and their personal life. The personal is political is a slogan that's kind of made everything political, and there's no safe, relaxing space. So one, if you start feeling edgy, if you start going on your apps and you notice that there's anxiety going on, turn off notifications is a really good thing. Just turn off your notifications so it's only there when you access it. And two, if you start to feel weird or negative, disengage from that content. And then let one idea come to you, and tackle one, have one thought about something, or limit your focus, really limit your focus to something that you care about, and then try to be productive with that. Like, have a conversation with that where you're not just ingesting this idea. And, if we want to get into there's a lot of single topics that lead to huge rabbit holes, like election fraud or QAnon or, whatever happened on January 6th, even that is just like this huge what actually happened. So you just limit yourself. Decide to tackle things that are human sized. That keeps the ego in check, and it keeps your anxiety in check too. I think that that's something the internet promises a lot and stretches ourselves out of our human container, and we need to kind of have a sense of humility and embodiment, and kind of hold our center of mass, because everyone doing that actually slows down the reactivity that we're in right now. So
I like that advice. I think that's excellent advice for people to especially as you start off with, just take a break, slow down if you have to, and protect yourself mentally.
But don't take a break from this channel or my channel.
No, I was just going to say, is there anything you want to plug or promote? That is the last thing I was going to ask.
Twitter, I'm a snarky kind of, sometimes I go overboard on Twitter, but I really like sentences. So that's where I have fun with sentences. Not everything I say is something that I believe. It's just fun to play with things, meaning things. And then also my YouTube channel, which is Benjamin A. Boyce on YouTube. And I also have a podcast if you want to just drive down the road. I have like 300, or I'm coming on 200 interviews. So I have a whole bunch of interviews with a whole bunch of people. It's the Voice of Reason, or Voice of Reason. You can find that on any given podcast platform. So do check that out.
All right, everyone. You heard the man. Please check out Benjamin Boyce's stuff. I do recommend the Voice of Reason. I recommend following him on Twitter. These are all things I do myself, and I want you to do it too. It's been a really great opportunity to speak to you, Benjamin. And
Thanks
I'll
a bunch,
see you all
Scott.
next time on Red Pill Nation.